My name is Selene Mooncrest. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been described in very gentle terms: calm, reasonable, low maintenance. I work in a role that rewards precision and discretion. I'm the kind of person people trust with responsibilities they don't want to think about again. From the outside, my life looked orderly. Stable marriage, stable career, no scandals, no dramatic implosions. And because of that, people often assumed there wasn't much happening beneath the surface. This story isn't about shock or spectacle. It's not about revenge, and it's not about proving anyone wrong in a loud way. It's about something quieter and far more common. It's about how our marriage became a war. I wasn't allowed to name. A conflict with no raised voices, no obvious villains, and no visible bruises. Just erosion. Day after day, year after year. If you had asked anyone around us, they would have told you we were fine. We didn't fight the way other couples did. We didn't make scenes. We didn't air our problems. What they didn't see was how every conflict was minimized, every wound ignored, how the absence of open hostility slowly became a weapon, how silence, when only one person is allowed to use it, can reshape an entire relationship. I want to be clear about something from the start. This is not a story about me being perfect or blameless. I made choices. I stayed quiet when I could have spoken earlier. I accepted explanations that felt wrong because they were easier than disruption. This is not a performance of victimhood. It's a record. A witness account of how power can exist without shouting, and how dominance doesn't always announce itself. What you'll hear over the course of this story is an emotional journey, not a dramatic arc. You'll see how I was perceived, how that perception hardened into expectation, and how I slowly realized the role I had been assigned without ever agreeing to it. You'll see the moment something shifted, not externally, but internally. No confrontation, no ultimatum, just clarity. From there, the story moves through preparation, restraint, and consequence. Not in a cinematic way, in a procedural way. The way real lives change, quietly, legally, irrevocably. There are no sudden miracles here, no explosive scenes, just decisions made after long observation, and outcomes that could not be undone once set in motion. I'm telling this now because stories like this are usually told from the outside, simplified into labels or advice. I wanted to tell it from the inside, without dramatizing it, without softening it, without asking you to take sides. So before we go any further, I want to ask you something gently and honestly. Have you ever been in a situation where nothing bad enough was happening, yet something inside you was slowly disappearing? To them, I was dependable in a way that felt almost abstract. Not admired, not consulted with urgency, just assumed. I was the person who would remember the appointment, smooth the misunderstanding, fill the gap when something was forgotten. In rooms where decisions were made, I was present but rarely centered. My presence registered as stability, not substance. In my marriage, this role felt natural at first. I was the calm one, the reasonable one, the one who didn't escalate. When something bothered me, I brought it up carefully, wrapped in context, softened by empathy. And when it was brushed aside, I told myself that compromise was maturity, that love didn't need constant validation, that choosing peace was a strength. That's how I learned to disappear politely. Friends described me as easygoing. Family members said I was low drama. Even my partner, especially my partner, praised my ability to let things go. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't letting things go. I was storing them, filing moments away with dates, tones, patterns. Not because I planned to use them someday, but because my mind refused to discard information that didn't make sense yet. I wasn't ignored outright. That would have been too obvious. Instead, my concerns were reframed. If I felt hurt, it was because I misunderstood. If I felt excluded, it was because I was too sensitive. If I noticed a shift in behavior, it was because I was tired or stressed. There was always a plausible explanation, one that made me feel faintly embarrassed for bringing it up at all. Over time, I learned which versions of myself were welcomed. The agreeable one, the efficient one, the one who didn't ask for emotional labor in return. I learned that silence earned approval faster than honesty. And so I became very good at being quiet without seeming withdrawn. At gatherings, I was the one refilling glasses while conversations flowed past me. At work dinners, I listened more than I spoke, even when I knew the numbers better than anyone else at the table. In my marriage, I became the emotional shock absorber, softening tensions before they reached him, adjusting my expectations so he wouldn't have to adjust his behavior. None of this felt like oppression at the time. It felt like adaptation. But adaptation has a cost. Slowly, subtly, I began to notice how little space I occupied in my own life. Decisions were made, logically, without my input. Plans shifted without discussion. When I expressed disappointment, it was met with confusion. Why are you upset? It's not a big deal. And because I couldn't point to a single catastrophic event, I questioned myself instead. This is how every conflict was minimized, every wound ignored. Not through cruelty, but through normalization. Through the steady suggestion that my internal experience was less reliable than everyone else's. I was never called weak. I was called nice. I was never told to stay quiet. I was thanked for being understanding. And that distinction matters, because it made the dynamic harder to name, harder to resist, harder to explain, even to myself. Looking back, I can see how our marriage became a war. I wasn't allowed to name. There were no battle lines, no declarations. Just a gradual redistribution of power that happened so smoothly, no one noticed it happening, including me. I want to be clear. I was not trapped. I was participating. I was choosing the path of least friction because I believed it led to harmony. Because I believed that if I just communicated better, waited longer, softened more, things would eventually balance out. But balance never comes to those who are always compensating. To them, I was reliable, predictable, emotionally self-sufficient, someone who didn't need much. And the more convincingly I played that role, the less anyone questioned whether it was true, or whether it was costing me something I hadn't yet learned how to protect. At the time, I didn't think of myself as invisible. I thought I was being mature. It would take me much longer to realize that maturity, when it only flows in one direction, stops being a virtue and starts becoming a liability. The first moment didn't announce itself. It rarely does. There was no raised voice. No insult sharp enough to echo afterward. Just a sentence delivered casually, in passing, and then replaced immediately by something else. Something practical. Something efficient. If I hadn't been paying attention, it would have disappeared completely. We were discussing a decision that affected both of us. Not a dramatic one. A scheduling change. A commitment that would shift how our weeks looked for the next few months. I remember the light in the room more than the words themselves. Late afternoon, filtered through the blinds, turning everything slightly gold. I offered an alternative. Not a refusal. Just a suggestion. He didn't argue with me. He smiled. And then he said, "You don't need to worry about that. I've already handled it." The conversation moved on. That was it. On the surface, it was considerate, efficient. But something about the phrasing lodged itself in me. "You don't need to worry. Not that we decided. I think this works better. Just a quiet removal of my involvement, framed as care." I remember nodding, smiling back, letting it pass. Later, when I replayed the moment in my head, I couldn't explain why it felt wrong. I told myself I was overthinking. That this was what partnership looked like, trusting the other person to take initiative. That my discomfort was unnecessary. Everyone else would have agreed. If I mentioned it to friends, they would have said I was lucky. He takes care of things. If I mentioned it to family, they would have reminded me how many people wish their partners were that decisive. So I said nothing, but I remembered it. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't bleed enough to demand attention. They don't disrupt the day, but they change how you move afterward. You become careful without realizing why. After that, similar moments followed. Minor, unremarkable. Decisions made without consultation. Opinions acknowledged but not integrated. When I circled back, gently, it was always explained away. It just made more sense this way. I didn't think you'd mind. You're usually okay with this kind of thing. Usually. That word did a lot of work. I began to notice how often my flexibility was used as a substitute for consent. How my history of being accommodating became evidence that I didn't need to be asked anymore. And because I had in fact been accommodating, I had no clean way to object without contradicting my own pattern. That's what made the first cut so effective. It was small enough to be deniable, small enough to be rationalized, small enough that resisting it felt disproportionate. At dinners, when plans were discussed, my role shifted subtly. I wasn't being asked what I thought. I was being informed of what we were doing. When I hesitated, even briefly, the room would go quiet in that polite way that signals inconvenience. I learned to fill that silence quickly, to reassure everyone that it was fine. And again, it was. Until it wasn't. I noticed how often I deferred automatically, before even checking in with myself. How my opinions softened mid-sentence, turning into questions instead of statements. How I began editing my reactions in real time, anticipating dismissal and preemptively disarming it. No one told me to do this. That's important. There was no explicit instruction, just a pattern that rewarded my quiet and penalized my friction. The first small cut wasn't about the decision itself. It was about what it trained me to do afterward. It taught me that my involvement was optional, that my perspective was supplemental, that harmony was maintained not by mutual adjustment, but by my flexibility alone. And because nothing overtly cruel had happened, I didn't grant myself the right to feel hurt. I told myself that love required generosity. Those relationships weren't scorecards, that keeping track was petty, but my mind kept track anyway. Not with anger, with precision. Looking back, I can see that this was the moment the ground shifted, just slightly. Enough that years later I would realize I had been standing on a slope the entire time, slowly sliding, while telling myself I was still on level ground. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic changed. That was the problem. Life continued with the same routines, the same shared spaces, the same surface-level affection. If anything, things seemed smoother. I had learned, unconsciously, where the edges were, and by staying well inside them, I reduced friction for everyone. That's how normalization begins, not with acceptance, but with relief. Each dismissal came wrapped in reason. Timing was bad. Stress was high. Intentions were good. And because there was always a context, I began to believe that context mattered more than impact. If no harm was meant, then harm didn't quite count. At least, that's what I told myself. When I raised concerns, they were met with reassurance rather than reflection. You're reading too much into it. That's not what I meant. Why are you making this a thing? The tone wasn't angry. It was puzzled. As if I had introduced an unnecessary complication into an otherwise simple situation. So I simplified myself instead. I learned to present my thoughts in a way that wouldn't interrupt the flow. I framed my needs as hypotheticals. I prefaced my feelings with apologies. Maybe I'm wrong, but this might be silly, but each qualifier made it easier for my words to be set aside without resistance. Over time, my inner barometer shifted. Things that once would have registered as disrespect now barely caused a ripple. Plans are changing without notice. Decisions finalized without discussion. My absence from conversations that affected me. None of it felt shocking anymore. It felt familiar. And familiarity is dangerous, because it convinces you that what you're experiencing is normal. Friends would ask how things were going, and I would say honestly that they were fine, because there were no fights to report, no betrayals to confess, no story that fits neatly into the concern. If I tried to articulate the discomfort, it dissolved as I spoke. It's nothing, really, and I believed that too. Inside, though, something was happening. I began to second-guess my instincts reflexively. When something felt off, my first response wasn't curiosity. It was correction. You're being unfair. You're too sensitive. You should be grateful. The voice that dismissed me from the outside had been internalized, and it was far more efficient that way. I told myself I was choosing my battles wisely, that not every moment needed to be addressed, that emotional resilience meant letting things roll off. What I didn't see was how few battles I was allowing myself to fight at all. In this phase, every conflict was minimized, every wound ignored, not because they vanished, but because they were reclassified. Hurt became an inconvenience. Disappointment became misunderstanding. Loneliness became independence. Each reframing moved the problem further away from something that required change. And then there was the comparison. Other couples have it worse. At least there's no shouting. At least there's stability. I used these thoughts like anchors, keeping me in place. They worked, until they didn't. The more I adapted, the more it seemed to confirm everyone's expectations of me. I was praised for being patient, for being supportive, for not making things difficult. And that praise carried an implicit warning: don't stop. I want to pause here and be precise. This wasn't abuse in the dramatic sense. There were no threats, no cruelty, no overt control. But there was an imbalance that deepened over time, fed by my willingness to accommodate and his comfort in being accommodated. And because it happened slowly, it felt mutual even when it wasn't. Looking back, I see how our marriage became a war. I wasn't allowed to name not through aggression, but through attrition, through the steady erosion of my sense of authorship in my own life, through the quiet agreement, never spoken, that my role was to adjust. At the time, I still believed things would correct themselves. If I stayed consistent, things would rebalance naturally, that relationships were living systems, and this was just a phase. But normalization doesn't lead back to equilibrium. It leads deeper into the pattern. And by the time I noticed how much of myself I was editing out of existence, it no longer felt like something I had the right or the energy to question out loud. It wasn't given to me in words. No one sat me down and explained what was expected. The role emerged the way habits do, through repetition, reinforcement, and the quiet withdrawal of alternatives. One day, I realized I was no longer choosing how I showed up. I was fulfilling something that already existed. I was the reliable one, the one who adjusted, the one who absorbed inconvenience without translating it into a complaint. If something needed to be done, it was assumed I would do it. If something needed to be smoothed over, it was assumed I would smooth it. And if something didn't go quite right, the expectation was not that it would be discussed, but that I would understand. At first, this role came with a certain dignity. There is pride in being capable, in being trusted, in being the person who holds things together. I told myself that this was simply adulthood, that everyone eventually settles into their strengths. But strength, when it's only extracted and never replenished, becomes something else. In my marriage, I became the emotional infrastructure. The part that didn't need maintenance because it was assumed to be permanent. When tensions arose elsewhere, I was the stabilizer. When plans shifted, I was the adapter. When feelings surfaced, his feelings, they were addressed immediately. When mine surfaced, they were contextualized, deferred, or quietly redirected. I noticed how rarely anyone asked what I wanted anymore. Not because they didn't care, but because they had learned that I would be fine either way. And because I was fine, until I wasn't, that assumption went unchallenged. This role extended beyond my marriage. At work, I was the one who could be trusted to take on just one more thing. The one who didn't need supervision. The one who didn't need credit. People relied on me not because they saw me clearly, but because they didn't have to. In social settings, I became the listener. The one who remembered birthdays. The one who followed up. The one who made emotional labor look effortless. And because it looked effortless, no one thought to ask what it cost. I didn't resist this role because, for a long time, it aligned with how I wanted to see myself. Capable. Composed. Needed. But slowly, something shifted. The more I fulfilled the role, the less room there was for any other version of me. There was no space for messiness, no tolerance for uncertainty, no curiosity about my interior life. I began to feel like a supporting structure in a building I no longer designed. The most unsettling part was how invisible this transition was to everyone else. From the outside, I hadn't changed. I was still calm, still reliable, still easy. The difference was internal. I felt myself shrinking, not in confidence but in presence. I was there but not fully engaged, present but not participating. This is where I began to understand how every conflict was minimized, every wound ignored, not because they didn't matter, but because acknowledging them would have disrupted the role I was playing. And the role was useful. To everyone but me. I also began to understand how our marriage became a war. I wasn't allowed to name because wars require acknowledgement. They require language. What I was experiencing had neither. It was a slow occupation, carried out with politeness and good intentions. I want to be honest here. I contributed to this. I accepted the role because it made me valuable, because it kept things running smoothly, because stepping out of it felt like betrayal. Not of him, but of the image everyone had of me. But roles, once assigned, have a way of solidifying. And the longer you play them, the harder it becomes to remember that they were never mandatory. By the time I realized how thoroughly this role defined me, I also realized something else. No one was going to question it for me. If it was going to change, it would require a kind of shift that couldn't be negotiated out loud. It would have to begin somewhere quieter. There was no argument that day. No dramatic realization. Nothing you could point to and say, "That's when it happened." In fact, if you had asked me that morning how things were going, I would have given you the same answer I always did. Fine. The shift didn't arrive with urgency. It arrived with stillness. I was alone in the house earlier than usual. The light was different. Cooler. Steadier. I remember standing in the kitchen, holding a mug I hadn't started drinking, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. It was an ordinary moment, which is why it caught me off guard. A thought surfaced, uninvited and fully formed. If nothing changes, this will be the rest of my life. Not in a catastrophic way, not with panic, just a calm, almost clinical observation. I didn't feel angered toward him. I didn't feel blamed. What I felt was a sudden, unmistakable awareness of time, of accumulation, of how long I had been adjusting without recalibration. And for the first time, I didn't immediately explain that feeling away. I let it sit. I noticed how automatic my self-corrections had become, how quickly I dismissed my own discomfort before it could fully register. And in that quiet kitchen, I realized something unsettling. I knew exactly how this dynamic would continue, because it had been consistent for years. There were no unknowns left, no mystery, just repetition. That realization stripped the situation of its ambiguity. It wasn't that I didn't understand what was happening. It was that I had been hoping understanding would be enough to change it. It wasn't. I thought about how often I had waited for the right moment to speak. How I had postponed conversations because the timing wasn't ideal, or because he was stressed, or because it didn't seem worth it. I had told myself that patience was kindness, that restraint was wisdom. But standing there, I saw the cost of that patience clearly. It hadn't bought me safety or respect. It had bought predictability. For everyone else, the shift wasn't emotional. It was structural. Something in me stopped leaning, stopped bracing. I didn't resolve to confront him. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't imagine outcomes. I simply acknowledged, without resistance, that the way things were organized did not include me as an equal participant. And once that was acknowledged, I couldn't unknow it. That's the moment the internal war ended. Not because it was won, but because I stopped fighting myself. I stopped asking whether my experience was valid. I stopped trying to make the situation more comfortable to tolerate. For the rest of the day, nothing changed externally. I went to work. I answered emails. I listened. I smiled when appropriate. But internally, something had disengaged. Not in bitterness, in clarity. I noticed details I had previously smoothed over. How often were decisions framed as conclusions rather than discussions? How often were my contributions logistical rather than directional? How rarely anyone paused to ask how something landed with me. And instead of absorbing those moments, I observed them. This was the day silence changed meaning. Before, my quiet had been reactive, protective, designed to preserve harmony. Now it has become intentional, not as a tactic, but as a boundary. I didn't need to announce anything yet. I needed to see the shape of things clearly, without distortion. I didn't feel empowered. That word comes later. What I felt was steady, grounded, as if I had stopped swimming against a current and was finally standing on something solid. That night, when he spoke about plans already made, I nodded as usual. But inside, I noted the pattern without flinching. No spike of disappointment, no urge to correct, just information. This is important. The shift was not a rejection of him. It was a return to myself. A quiet reclamation of authorship that didn't require permission. From the outside, I was still the same. Calm, agreeable, reliable. But internally, a line had been drawn. Not in anger, in recognition. And once that line existed, everything that followed would be shaped by it, even if no one else could see it yet. After the shift, my silence changed texture. It was no longer a reflex, no longer an effort to keep things smooth. It became deliberate, measured, almost observational. I didn't withdraw. I participated exactly as much as before. The difference was internal. I was no longer trying to be understood. This was not an act of punishment. It wasn't passive aggression. It was containment. I stopped offering context for my feelings before anyone asked. I stopped softening observations that didn't need cushioning. And when something felt off, I didn't rush to resolve the discomfort. I let it exist. I let the moment pass without correcting it into something more palatable. What surprised me was how little anyone noticed. From the outside, my behavior was identical. I was still calm, still cooperative, still reliable. But because I was no longer filling in emotional gaps automatically, small absences began to form. Pauses that had previously been covered by my reassurance. Silences that no longer came with explanations. And those silences were interpreted in a very specific way. As compliance. People often mistake restraint for agreement, especially when they're used to you absorbing friction on their behalf. My silence was read as ease, as acceptance, as confirmation that everything was fine. That misinterpretation gave me something I hadn't had before. Time. I listened more carefully, not just to words, but to sequences. I noticed how often plans were communicated after they were finalized. How often were my contributions framed as execution rather than input? How often did emotional labor flow in one direction? I began to document, not in a dramatic way, just notes, dates, financial distributions, patterns of decision-making. Not because I intended to confront anyone with them, but because I wanted my understanding to be precise, undeniable. There was a calmness to this phase that I didn't expect. Without the constant effort to manage perceptions, I had energy again. I slept better. I thought more clearly. The anxiety I had attributed to stress receded once I stopped arguing internally with my own reality. This is where quiet dominance begins. Not in control over others, but in control over yourself. I didn't announce boundaries. I embodied them. When I was asked to adjust last minute, I did so neutrally, but I stopped compensating emotionally. No apologies, no over-explaining. When decisions were presented as fait accompli, I acknowledged them without endorsement, and still, no one noticed. Or perhaps they noticed, but found nothing they could object to. After all, I wasn't refusing. I wasn't arguing. I wasn't demanding change. I was simply no longer buffering the consequences. This is where every conflict was minimized, every wound ignored, took on a new meaning. Now, it wasn't my wounds being ignored. It was the growing gaps in expectation that went unaddressed because they were inconvenient to examine. I want to be clear. This silence was not strategic in the manipulative sense. It was preparatory. I was learning the true structure of my life as it existed, not as I had hoped it would be. And in doing so, I discovered something important. My absence, even partial, created instability. Not enough to alarm anyone yet, but enough to reveal how much I had been holding together quietly. This was the phase where others mistook my stillness for weakness, for resignation, for endurance. And that assumption allowed me to see how deeply it was embedded. I didn't correct it. The strength that needs to be announced isn't strength. And the work I was doing now required invisibility. Silence, once chosen, becomes a lens. It sharpens your view. It filters out noise. And it shows you, with uncomfortable clarity, who benefits from things staying exactly as they are. By the end of this phase, I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was informed. And once you are fully informed, the next steps are no longer emotional. They are logistical. What they never noticed wasn't a single action. It was a shift in attention. A reallocation of focus so subtle it registered as nothing at all. While they continued to move through familiar routines, I began to see the structure beneath them. How things were sustained, who carried weight, where assumptions quietly replaced consent. Because I wasn't reacting anymore, I had room to observe. I noticed how finances were discussed in summaries rather than specifics. How decisions were justified after the fact instead of shaped together. I noticed how often my name appeared on documents connected to responsibility, and how rarely it appeared next to authority. These weren't accidents. They were patterns that had formed because no one had reason to question them, including me. I started asking neutral questions, not aloud, but internally. Who benefits from this arrangement? Who absorbs the inconvenience? What would happen if I stopped compensating here? These weren't accusations. They were audits. At work, this came naturally. I was trained to look for inefficiencies, for quiet risks hiding in stable systems. I applied the same lens to my personal life. I reviewed shared accounts. I tracked contributions over time. I noted how often decisions were framed as mutual when the process hadn't been. This wasn't preparation for conflict. It was preparation for accuracy. I learned more in those months than I had in years of trying to communicate better. Without the noise of emotional justification, the data spoke clearly, not loudly. Clearly. And clarity is difficult to argue with once you allow yourself to see it. What surprised me most was how little resistance there was to my subtle disengagement. No one pulled me aside to ask if I was okay. No one noticed that I had stopped volunteering emotional reassurance. That absence revealed something I hadn't fully grasped before. My emotional labor had been invisible because it had been uninterrupted. You only notice infrastructure when it fails. I also noticed something else. How comfortable everyone was with my silence, as long as it didn't disrupt outcomes. My quiet wasn't interpreted as depth or thoughtfulness. It was interpreted as availability. As a blank space onto which expectations could continue to be projected. That realization was sobering, but not painful. Pain requires surprise. This was confirmation. During this time, I became meticulous. I organized documents. I updated the records. I learned where things were stored, how decisions were formalized, and what processes governed change. I didn't rush. I didn't skip steps. I moved with the same care I had always used. Only now it was directed toward myself. This is the part no one tells you about reclaiming agency. It's boring. It's administrative. It's quiet. There are no emotional highs. Just steady alignment between what you know and what you prepare for. I didn't fantasize about outcomes. I didn't rehearse conversations. I focused on understanding the full scope of my position, legally, financially, practically. Knowledge replaced hope. Structure replaced waiting. And still, nothing changed externally. That's what made this phase so invisible. From the outside, I was still the same person. Still calm. Still present. Still cooperative. The only difference was that I was no longer surprised by anything. And because of that, nothing could destabilize me. This is where our marriage became a war. I wasn't allowed to name reached a turning point. Not because anyone else sensed it, but because I stopped participating in the illusion that things would resolve themselves without structural change. And this is where every conflict was minimized, every wound ignored, stopped being something that happened to me and became something I simply documented, without interpretation. Facts don't need validation. They exist regardless of acknowledgement. What they never noticed was that I had stopped needing permission to understand my own life. They didn't notice because nothing had broken yet. Systems rarely announce collapse in advance. They function right up until the moment they don't. And by then, the groundwork has already been laid elsewhere. By the end of this phase, I wasn't planning an exit. I wasn't planning anything dramatic at all. I was simply positioned, informed, ready for whatever clarity demanded next. And clarity, once achieved, has a way of narrowing your options until only one remains that doesn't require you to abandon yourself again. The reveal wasn't something I stumbled upon. It wasn't a secret uncovered by chance or a dramatic discovery hidden behind a single document. It emerged gradually, through alignment, through the slow convergence of facts that had always existed but had never been assembled in the same frame. When everything was laid out, timelines, responsibilities, dependencies, I saw the full picture clearly for the first time. Not emotionally, structurally. I understood how much of the stability in our life rested on systems I managed without recognition. Financial continuity, administrative continuity, emotional continuity. I wasn't just contributing, I was anchoring, and because I had done it quietly, it had been mistaken for something automatic, something that didn't require reciprocity. The reveal was this. I had leverage, not because I had hidden power, but because I had been reliable for so long that the absence of my reliability would change everything. That realization didn't bring satisfaction. It brought gravity. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt careful. Because leverage, once seen, carries responsibility. It forces you to decide who you are when you finally understand your position. It asks whether you will use knowledge to dominate or to exit with integrity. This was never about winning. It was about no longer losing myself. I examined the implications slowly. What would shift if I stepped back? What would remain functional? And what depended entirely on my unseen labor? These weren't hypotheticals. They were scenarios I tested quietly, in small ways. I paused in places I had previously rushed. I stopped preempting problems that weren't mine to solve. The system reacted, not with alarm, but with subtle friction. Delays appeared. Confusion surfaced. Questions were asked, not with concern, but with assumption. You'll handle this, right? And for the first time, I didn't answer immediately. That pause told me everything. The private reveal wasn't that I could cause disruption. Anyone can do that. It was that I could choose not to prevent it, and that choice shifted the balance entirely. I sat with that knowledge for a long time. I didn't rush into action. I didn't confront him with it. There was no point. Leverage explained out loud loses its quiet power. It becomes something to be negotiated, resisted, or reframed. Instead, I asked myself a more difficult question. What outcome aligns with who I want to be, not who this situation has trained me to be? The answer wasn't obvious at first. There was grief in realizing how much had been taken for granted. There was disappointment in seeing how little curiosity there had been about my interior life. But there was also relief. Relief in knowing that I wasn't imagining things. That my discomfort had been data, not weakness. This was the moment where every conflict was minimized, every wound ignored, and finally made sense as a system, not a failure of communication. And systems don't change because you explain them better. They change when their inputs change. I also understood something else. The longer I stayed without altering the structure, the more complicit I became in my own erasure. Not because I hadn't spoken loudly enough, but because I now knew better. That knowledge narrowed my choices. I could continue as before, now fully aware of the cost. Or I could initiate change, not emotionally, not explosively, but procedurally, carefully, in a way that didn't require validation or agreement to be effective. The reveal stayed private because it needed to. It was mine. It belonged to my clarity, not to anyone else's understanding. Sharing it prematurely would have invited interference. Silence protected it. This is the quietest moment in the story, and the most decisive. Because once you understand where the true balance lies, you can no longer pretend you don't know how things will end if nothing changes. And that understanding brings you to a threshold. You don't cross it out of anger. You cross it because standing still becomes a form of self-betrayal. I didn't step forward yet, but I knew with certainty that I would. The decision didn't arrive all at once. It clarified itself over time, as each alternative was examined and quietly set aside. I didn't frame it as stay or leave, or fight or surrender. Those binaries belonged to a more dramatic story than the one I was living. This was about alignment. I laid out the options the way I would approach any complex problem, without emotion, without urgency, and without self-deception. I asked what each path required of me, not in effort, but in identity. Staying as things were required me to continue minimizing myself. Even with full awareness, it would mean consenting to a structure that depended on my silence. That option was no longer neutral. It would be an active choice to participate in my own disappearance. Confrontation, in the traditional sense, was another option. A long conversation. Emotional exposure. Requests for change. But I understood the limitations of that approach now. Not because he was incapable of listening, but because the system didn't reward listening. It rewarded continuity. Any change achieved through emotional appeal would be provisional, dependent on my vigilance. I would become the manager of my own equality. That wasn't freedom. There was also the option of gradual disengagement without resolution. A slow drift. A quiet emotional exit while remaining physically present. That path was familiar, comfortable even, and deeply dishonest to both of us. The final option was structural change. Not dramatic, not vengeful, simply irreversible. This was the option that aligned with what I now understood. It didn't require him to see things my way. It didn't require acknowledgement or apology. It didn't require me to perform pain convincingly enough to earn respect. It required preparation, precision, and a willingness to be misunderstood in the short term. Choosing this path didn't feel empowering. It felt solemn, like signing a document you hope you'll never need, but knowing you will. I grieved, not for the relationship as it was, but for the version of it I had hoped might emerge if I stayed patient long enough. This is where our marriage became a war. I wasn't allowed to name ended internally, not because peace was declared, but because I stopped fighting for recognition in a system that thrived on my predictability. And this is where every conflict was minimized, every wound ignored, became irrelevant. I no longer needed those conflicts to be acknowledged in order to act. I had acknowledged them myself. Once the decision crystallized, the emotional noise quieted. There was no more oscillation, no more second-guessing. The clarity was steady, almost impersonal. I set a timeline. Not for him. For me. I determined what needed to be in place before anything shifted outwardly. I resisted the urge to rush. Irreversible decisions made in haste often recreate the very instability you're trying to escape. I also made a rule for myself. No justifications. I wouldn't argue my way into permission. I wouldn't explain my reasoning prematurely. This decision was not a debate. It was a conclusion. That meant accepting certain costs. Misinterpretation. Surprise. The possibility that others would reframe my actions in ways that made sense to them. I accepted that without resentment. People explain what they don't understand in ways that protect their own narratives. I didn't need to correct them. By the time I reached the decision point, the emotional weight had already been processed. What remained was execution, not in secret but in silence. This wasn't an escape. It was a transition, one that honored the truth of my experience without demanding anyone else validate it. The moment I committed internally, everything slowed down. Not because I hesitated, but because I knew exactly what I was doing next. And once a decision is made at that level, there is no going back. Only forward, with care. Once the decision was made, urgency disappeared. Not because time stopped mattering, but because panic no longer did. I wasn't racing toward an outcome. I was building one. Quietly, methodically, in plain sight. This was the phase where action replaced contemplation. I didn't announce changes. I didn't signal dissatisfaction. Outwardly, nothing shifted. My routines stayed intact. My demeanor stayed calm. Anyone observing would have seen continuity. That was intentional. Stability creates invisibility. Internally, everything was in motion. I separated what needed to be disentangled. Finances, responsibilities, dependencies, and addressed each piece without emotion. I gathered information. I verified assumptions. I made sure I understood the implications of every step before taking it. Not because I feared consequences, but because I respected them. This wasn't secrecy for its own sake. It was containment. I knew that once others sensed movement, they would respond. Not necessarily maliciously, but defensively. Silence preserved accuracy. I consulted professionals without dramatizing the situation. I didn't frame myself as wronged or victimized. I framed the facts. Structures respond better to facts than to feelings. I asked practical questions. I listened carefully to answers I didn't like as much as the ones I did. At home, I continued to participate. But I stopped compensating. When something was forgotten, I didn't rush to correct it. When confusion arose, I allowed it to exist. Not as punishment, but as reality. The system adjusted awkwardly. Not enough to alarm anyone. Just enough to reveal how much effort had previously gone unnoticed. I watched this without commentary. Observation is a form of respect for yourself. This was also when I became very precise about language. I stopped saying we when decisions hadn't been mutual. I stopped agreeing in advance. I acknowledged information without endorsing it. These were small shifts, but they mattered. Language shapes expectation. Still, no one confronted me. Because there was nothing to confront. I hadn't violated any rules. I had simply stopped overfunctioning. This phase required discipline. There were moments when old habits resurfaced. The impulse to smooth, to reassure, to explain. I resisted them gently, not with force, but with consistency. Every time I chose restraint, the clarity deepened. This is where quiet dominance often gets misunderstood. It's not about control, it's about alignment. When your actions match your understanding, you stop leaking energy. You stop negotiating with yourself. I wasn't waiting for permission. I was preparing for inevitability. There were nights when I felt the weight of what was coming. Not fear, but gravity. Change, even necessary change, carries loss. I allowed myself to feel that privately. I didn't numb it. I didn't outsource it. Processing it internally kept it from spilling outward prematurely. Throughout this phase, our marriage became a war. I wasn't allowed to name existed only as history. The conflict was no longer active. The outcome was simply unfolding, and every conflict was minimized, every wound ignored, and no longer did my experience describe it. Not because wounds had healed, but because they no longer dictated my behavior. The most telling part of this phase was how little interference there was. When you stop explaining yourself, people often assume there's nothing to explain. Silence creates space, and space reveals who expects you to fill it. By the time the groundwork was complete, there was nothing impulsive left to do. Everything that remained would happen in sequence, whether or not anyone was ready for it. I didn't feel victorious. I felt settled. And when you reach that state, consequences are no longer something you fear. They're simply the next phase. The consequences didn't arrive with confrontation. They arrived as an absence. Small disruptions that didn't seem connected at first, but slowly accumulated into something harder to ignore. Nothing broke dramatically. Things just stopped flowing as smoothly as they always had. At first, there was minor confusion. A missed detail. A delayed response. The kind of thing that happens in any household, in any partnership. Easily dismissed. Easily corrected. Except I didn't correct it. Not out of spite, out of accuracy. I watched how quickly inconvenience surfaced when my quiet interventions were removed. How often were questions asked that had never been asked before? Not because the answers were new, but because the assumption that I would handle them had finally failed. There was a subtle shift in tone. Not anger, puzzlement. A sense that something was off, without clarity about what it was. I heard it in the phrasing. "Didn't you already take care of that? I thought this was your thing. Why is this suddenly an issue?" Suddenly. That word carried more weight than it should have. From my perspective, nothing was sudden. The system was simply operating without its invisible supports. The consequences weren't punishments. They were results. I stayed calm, consistent. I didn't point out patterns. I didn't explain cause and effect. I allowed reality to do that work on its own timeline. This was uncomfortable for him. I could see that. Not because he felt wronged, but because he felt unmoored. Systems feel stable until they don't. And then the absence of familiar support creates anxiety. He began to ask questions, not about me, but about logistics, about why things felt harder, about why decisions weren't landing the way they used to. I answered factually, neutrally, without cushioning. This is where every conflict was minimized. Every wound ignored came back into focus for him. Not as a phrase, but as an experience. For the first time, he was encountering friction without my mediation, and he didn't like it. Still, there was no confrontation, just growing awareness, growing discomfort. Others noticed too. Small things, missed follow-ups. Emotional labor is no longer absorbed seamlessly. The room felt different, even if no one could say why. And because I wasn't naming it, there was no narrative to latch onto. That's the thing about consequences. They don't require explanation to be felt. I remained steady throughout this phase. Not cold, not distant, just present without overextension. I responded when asked. I did what was clearly mine to do, and I left the rest untouched. This is where people often expect guilt to surface. A desire to fix things, to restore equilibrium. I felt none of that, not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood what equilibrium had cost me. The discomfort around me increased, but it didn't destabilize me. In fact, it confirmed what I already knew. The arrangement had only worked because I had made it work. That realization, now externalized, was unsettling for everyone else. I want to be precise again. This wasn't retaliation. I didn't remove support to teach a lesson. I removed it because it was never sustainable. The system was correcting itself. By the end of this phase, the shift was undeniable. Not yet catastrophic, but no longer ignorable. Something had changed, and it wasn't going back to how it was. I could feel the tension building, not explosive, but heavy. Like pressure in a room before weather changes. People sense it, even if they can't articulate it. And once consequences are felt without explanation, The next instinct is to fix things. But by then, the window for easy fixes had already closed. The attempt to fix it didn't come with accountability. It came as an urgency. Suddenly, conversations that had never seemed necessary became important. Questions that had once felt intrusive were now framed as concern. There was a noticeable shift in tone. Lighter, more attentive, almost careful. As if someone had realized they were standing on unstable ground and were testing it with their foot. He asked how I was doing. Not casually, not in passing. The question lingered, waiting for something specific to surface. I answered honestly, but not expansively. I'm fine. Not as a dismissal. As a statement, because at that point, I was. This confused him. What he wanted, I realized, wasn't information. It was a restoration. A return to the familiar rhythm where things worked without visible effort, where friction dissolved quickly, where the system self-corrected. But systems don't rewind. They only adjust forward. He began to suggest changes, small ones at first. More discussion, more checking in. An interest in my perspective that felt new, but also oddly misaligned with the timing. These weren't bad intentions. They were simply late. That lateness mattered, because by the time he was ready to engage, I was no longer seeking engagement. I wasn't withholding emotionally. I had already relocated my center of gravity elsewhere. This is one of the hardest truths to accept. Repair requires presence before disengagement becomes complete. After that, what looks like effort can feel like an interruption. I watched him try to understand what had changed, without access to the internal process that had led there. From his perspective, the shift was abrupt. From mine, it was overdue. He asked if something was wrong. I said, things have been wrong for a long time. Not accusingly, just accurately. He was surprised by that, genuinely. And that surprise told me everything I needed to know. This is where our marriage became a war. I wasn't allowed to name revealed its final shape. Not a battle between two people, but a misalignment in awareness. I had been living with the conflict internally for years. He was encountering it for the first time, and that gap couldn't be closed retroactively. He wanted specifics, examples, moments he could address. I didn't provide them, not because they didn't exist, but because revisiting them would have required me to reopen wounds I had already healed by acknowledging them privately. I wasn't interested in relitigation. He tried to reassure me, to promise change, to emphasize intentions. And I listened. Calmly, respectfully. I didn't argue. I didn't contradict. I didn't escalate. But I also didn't move. This was when panic appeared. Not loud, but palpable. The sense that something fundamental was slipping away without clear instructions on how to stop it. And panic, when it arrives this late, often seeks shortcuts. He asked what I needed. That question, once rare, now came too easily. And the ease of it revealed how much had been avoided before. I told him the truth. I needed you to notice before now. That was the moment the conversation stalled. Because there was no actionable response to that. No fix that could be implemented going forward to change the past. This is where every conflict was minimized. Every wound ignored reached its endpoint. Not in accusation, but in consequence. The wounds hadn't been dramatic enough to demand attention when they occurred. Now, their accumulation was too significant to undo. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt resolved. He was trying to catch up emotionally to a place I had already passed through and left behind. And that temporal mismatch meant that even a sincere effort couldn't bridge the distance. By the end of this phase, it was clear to both of us that we were no longer discussing improvement. We were discussing reality. And reality, once acknowledged, doesn't negotiate. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't look like what people imagined. There were no raised voices, no accusations thrown like weapons, no emotional flood demanding release. By the time we sat across from each other, everything volatile had already burned out, quietly, over years. What remained was clarity. We spoke in measured sentences, not because we were careful, but because there was nothing left to defend. He wanted to understand. I wanted to be precise. Those goals are not the same, but for once, they didn't collide. He asked when I had started feeling this way. I told him the truth. I didn't start feeling this way all at once. Two stopped unfeeling it. That landed differently than I expected. Not as an accusation, but as a recalibration. It shifted the frame from what did I do wrong to what did I not see. I explained without detail. I didn't list moments. I didn't revisit arguments. I described patterns. Absence of inquiry, predictable dismissal. The way my silence had been mistaken for resilience instead of restraint. I spoke calmly, not because I was detached, but because I had already mourned what this conversation represented. He listened, truly listened. And I could see that he was trying to reconcile this version of events with his own memory. That reconciliation was difficult, not because he was unwilling, but because his experience of the relationship had been supported by my invisible labor. When I stopped doing that labor, the contrast felt like a loss. To him. To me, it felt like honesty. He asked why I hadn't said something sooner. I paused before answering. Not for effect, but because the answer deserved care. I did. Just not in ways you were trained to recognize. That was the most direct thing I said. This confrontation wasn't about assigning blame. It was about aligning timelines. He was grieving something he had just discovered. I had already passed through that grief alone. That asymmetry mattered. I didn't ask for change. I didn't propose conditions. I didn't threaten consequences. I explained the decision that had already been made, not as an ultimatum, but as information. He asked if there was any way back. I didn't answer immediately, not because I was unsure, but because finality should never be rushed. Then I said, not without me becoming someone I no longer am. That was the moment the conversation settled into stillness. Not tension, acceptance. The kind that arrives when both people realize they are standing on different ground. This was the only confrontation we needed. No heat, no performance, just two adults acknowledging a truth that had been deferred for too long. In that moment, our marriage became a war. I wasn't allowed to name. Finally, it had language, not as a battle, but as a misalignment that could no longer be bridged without cost. And every conflict was minimized. Every wound ignored found its resolution not in apology, but in recognition. He saw it now. Too late to change the outcome, but not too late to understand why it had happened. I left that conversation without adrenaline, without shaking, without the urge to replay it. Closure doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it feels like a clean line drawn at last. I didn't walk away angry. I walked away intact. Who I am now is not a reaction to what happened. That distinction matters to me. I didn't rebuild myself in opposition to the past, and I didn't harden into someone unrecognizable. I simply removed the parts of me that had been contorting to fit a structure that was never designed with me in mind. From the outside, my life looks quieter than before. Fewer explanations, fewer adjustments, fewer emotional negotiations. But inside, there is an ease I didn't know was missing until it arrived. I still value calm. I still value thoughtfulness. Those traits were never the problem. What changed is that they are no longer extracted from me without consent. I choose where they go, and when they are not reciprocated, I notice, without internal debate. I no longer confuse endurance with virtue. There is a steadiness in my days now that isn't dependent on anyone else's comfort. Decisions are made with me, not around me. When something feels off, I address it early, not with urgency, but with clarity. And if clarity is unwelcome, I don't translate it into something softer just to be accommodated. That alone has reshaped my relationships. Some connections deepened, others fell away naturally. Not because of conflict, but because they were built on versions of me that no longer exist. I let that happen without resentment. People are allowed to miss the roles you stop playing. I've learned that respect isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with grand gestures or emotional declarations. It shows up as curiosity, as a pause, as inclusion. And when those things are absent, I no longer explain their absence away. This is the quietest form of confidence I know. When I think back on the years when every conflict was minimized, every wound ignored, I don't feel bitterness. I feel informed. Those years taught me how easily composure can be mistaken for consent, and how quickly your inner life can become invisible if you don't protect it. And when I think about how our marriage became a war, I wasn't allowed to name. I don't frame it as something that happened to me anymore. I frame it as a context I outgrew, one that required silence from me to survive. I don't offer silence that way now. That doesn't mean I explain myself to everyone. It means I no longer participate where my presence is optional, but my labor is expected. I don't audition for belonging. I don't prove my worth through accommodation. There is a groundedness in knowing that if something requires you to disappear in order to function, it is not a place you are meant to stay. I'm not hardened. I'm not closed off. I'm simply no longer available for erasure. That boundary has changed how I move through the world more than any confrontation ever could have. This version of me isn't louder. She's clearer. And clarity, I've learned, is what remains when you stop negotiating with your own perception. There isn't a dramatic moral to this story. No sharp lesson delivered in hindsight. No villain to point to. No moment where everything suddenly made sense because someone finally apologized. What there is, instead, is a quiet truth that took me a long time to learn. If you have to disappear for something to work, it doesn't work. That's it. That's the center of it all. For years, I believed that love was measured by how much you could absorb without complaint. That maturity meant translating your pain into something easier for others to handle. That if you stayed calm long enough, patient enough, reasonable enough, things would naturally rebalance. They don't. Systems rebalance only when their inputs change. Relationships are no different. When every conflict was minimized, every wound ignored, it wasn't because those conflicts were insignificant. It was because acknowledging them would have required change. And change is uncomfortable for people who benefit from the way things are. This story isn't about blame. My former partner wasn't cruel. He wasn't calculating. He was simply comfortable in a structure that didn't ask him to look too closely at what kept it standing. And I was complicit in maintaining it, because I thought silence was kindness. Silence is only kind when it doesn't cost you your voice. When our marriage became a war, I wasn't allowed to name. I didn't recognize it as a war because there were no visible weapons. But there was attrition. There was occupation. There was the slow redirection of my energy away from myself and into keeping things stable for everyone else. Walking away wasn't an act of aggression. It was an act of alignment. The real shift didn't happen when I left. It happened when I stopped asking myself to tolerate what I would never ask someone else to endure. When I trusted my perception enough to act without needing it validated first. If there's anything I hope you take from this, it's this. You don't need a catastrophic reason to leave a situation that is quietly diminishing you. You don't need proof dramatic enough to convince outsiders. Discomfort that persists, that accumulates, that requires you to keep shrinking. It's already information. Pay attention to where you are consistently expected to adapt, and where adaptation never flows back to you. And if you're listening to this and thinking, nothing is technically wrong, but something feels missing, that feeling deserves your respect, not your dismissal. I'm not sharing this story to tell you what to do. I'm sharing it to name something many people live inside without language. Sometimes hearing it articulated is enough to begin asking different questions of your own life. So I'll end with one question, and I mean it genuinely. Have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that you were being valued for how little you needed rather than for who you actually were? If that question resonates with you, I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments.